They built a luxury pool on my land and then told me I was the one trespassing. Yeah, that happened, and if you think that sounds like a late-night sketch, trust me, I wish it had been. Let me back up a sec, because this mess didn't start with chlorine and lounge chairs. It started with a deed, a dusty will, and the kind of small-town boldness that thinks rules are optional. I inherited 7 stubborn acres in County, Nevada, from my grandfather, 7 acres of scrub and sage, a handful of junipers, and a horizon that belonged to nobody but the wind, and I drove out there the day the probate cleared thinking about 2 things: where to park my trailer, and how many beers would be required to celebrate finally getting the title. The sun was low, the road crunchy under the tires, and the land smelled like dust and possibility. Until I rounded the South Copse and walked into a postcard I'd never ordered, an Olympic-sized pool, stone decking, a cabana with a sign reading Silver Creek Ridge HOA, private use only, and a parking strip so tidy it looked staged for a brochure. I stood there with my glove box map in my hand, and my mouth open like someone who'd just seen a stranger living in his house, because the map, the deed, the GPS, they all said the southern fence line was mine. I snapped photos, drove the perimeter slow as molasses, and by nightfall had a licensed surveyor scheduled for the first light. Mitchell showed up with a tripod, a quiet smile, and a scanner. After 4 hours he handed me a certified printout and said, 62% of that pool, filtration, decking, the works, sits on your parcel. I felt lightheaded and oddly amused, like a man waking up to find a neighbor had built a chandelier in his garage. I tried being reasonable, polite certified letter to the HOA, 3 options: remove it, lease it, or buy the patch. I even suggested a modest rent, because I'm not a monster. A week passed. No reply. Instead I got an email from Karen Montgomery, the HOA president, titled Ease and Desist, Unlawful Harassment and Land Use Threat, which accused me of extortion for asking about my own land. She closed with the kind of condescension that wants a ribbon tied on it. Please refrain from future contact unless via HOA counsel. She'd managed to be both wrong and performatively offended in one paragraph. So I filed for a temporary injunction. While the court paper worked its way through, I hired a fencing crew out of sparks, powder-coated steel, posts to the inch of the county line, because if someone wants a war of inches, I'll give them a wall of them. 2 days later the crew started marking posts, and by mid-morning Karen was storming across my lot in a sun hat like a general with bad posture. "You cannot do this," she barked, phone aloft like a badge. I handed her the survey. She snatched it, snapped photos, called it harassment, claimed obstruction of community resources. She even threatened to call the sheriff. The sheriff showed up 30 minutes later, Lieutenant McKenna, a man with a belt that suggested he'd seen all sorts of weird, and he flipped through my folder like a professional who prefers facts to theater. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, "you do realize this fence is on his property, right?" She sputtered about disputed land and community usage, but the permit, deed, survey, they were clean. The team finished half the perimeter that afternoon, and I started posting private property signs every 20 feet. Not passive-aggressive, just clear. Emails from the HOA were furious and petulant. An attorney's letter arrived that smelled more of bluff than bite, and then someone slid a red ink note under my windshield. Anonymous, angry, cursive that might have been written by a villain. Life carried on in a surreal way. Lifeguards showed up at a locked gate, teenagers peered through mesh, and one of Karen's flyers advised neighbors to exercise caution around hostile livestock, which is to say they called my cows terrifying PR. Then they sued me. Her complaint called me a malicious obstructionist, accused me of fabricating lines with private consultants, and the kicker, attached a scanned letter supposedly written by my grandfather, gifting the southern parcel to the community as a gesture of goodwill. My grandfather wrote on a typewriter until he died. That letter looked like it had been typed in Microsoft Word and watermarked for self-importance. My lawyer Jen ran forensic tests and laughed like a villain had handed her a bouquet of evidence. The metadata said it was created 5 months ago. The phrasing matched 5 HOA letters from the past year. And the signature? Forged. That forged letter was the pivot, the twist that made the case go from nuisance to criminal. We filed a counterclaim, trespass, fraudulent occupation, attempted forgery, and asked the court to bar the HOA from using the pool until this thing was sorted. The county building office obliged, and their inspector's first report was delicious. The HOA's final construction certificate used coordinates that conveniently excluded my southern 50 feet. They had permits for a smaller pool on their land, then built farther. They had expanded on paper and concrete without an amendment. In other words, the pool had grown over my deed the old-fashioned way, by audacity. Here's the part some people miss. When a person or group can't get land honestly, they try to manufacture the history. They stitch together maps, forge letters, and create an air of inevitability. Nobody checks, people pay, and then the past looks like consent. But fraud leaves residues, phone calls, metadata, shaky print jobs, and if you know where to look, it smells like hubris and toner. We served up the forgery to the court and called Mitchell to testify. GPS overlays and aerials projected on the courtroom screen, while the judge squinted like he'd been chewing on the case, and finally decided it tasted bad. The HOA's attorney tried to argue historical use and community need, which sounds noble until you remember they'd staged a full-blown community splash party after the court temporarily barred the pool. Party balloons, kids running, Karen beaming under a satellite-sized sun hat. And a parking lot opened like it had always been public. They'd thrown open the gates on a court order. That party was the day deputies cuffed Karen for contempt in front of her margarita. The sheriff read the law the way you might read the rules to a dog that keeps stealing socks. Slow, firm, decisive. It was the kind of moment people remember, like when a bully gets sent to the principal's office and the hallway feels a little safer. A surprising ally turned up in the middle of all this. Georgia, the county clerk, a woman with a stack of dusty logbooks and a patience that had made her good at her job for 30 years. She flipped through resolutions and found the 1982 entry, public trail decommissioned at the request of J. Randall, my grandfather. No bench, no easement, no community path. That was the twist that knifed right through the HOA's narrative. Real paper, archived in a room where people actually keep records. Court unraveled the rest. The judge called the HOA's historic map what it was, a fantasy with a sharp pedigree, and ruled in my favor, damages awarded, the pool's encroaching features declared mine until they were removed or I chose otherwise. And a sentence for the forgery that left Karen on probation, and assigned her to collect trash on Route 395 for community service. Poetic, maybe, but legal. I didn't take satisfaction in punishment so much as rectification. The water that had been a wedge on my land became a strangely apt asset. I got the county assessor to reappraise the structure as part of my property, filed for a small business license, and turned the place into a private wellness venue. Cedar benches, a dry sauna, native landscaping. By invitation retreats, because if someone builds a thing on your land and then sues you for it, the very least you can do is decide what that thing becomes. The HOA's parking lot was torn out, their floodlights removed, and the county remapped the boundary with bright stakes that said in no uncertain terms, "This is where the line is." Now when I walk past the pool on a summer morning, I hear laughter, not fury, and the herd grazes like nothing dramatic ever happened. I planted a cedar sign above the new gate. Pasture Springs, private spa and retreat, and beneath it, cheeky as a postcard, a framed copy of the forged letter stamped with red. Forgery, do not accept. Because sometimes you need a little public scolding to remind people that boundaries are real, physical, legal, moral. So here's the question I keep asking folks at the feed store and on the porch. When community starts sounding like a sentence, when bylaws become blunt instruments, who gets to decide what a neighborhood is allowed to be? Is it the people who live there, with deeds and history, or the people who want to redraw maps to suit their weekend hobbies? Tell me, have you ever been on the receiving end of a rule book used like a club, or watched good intentions dress up as land theft? Drop your stories. If you've got an HOA horror or a victory, share it below, because sometimes the next person who reads your comment will find the courage to check their deed, call the county clerk, and stand their ground.